started thinking about what I wanted out of a desk. So I thought about essential and non-essential requirements. For essential requirements, it had to be big enough to fit 2 monitors and to have space to do small projects. It should be easily assembled and disassembled for moving. There should be drawers for storage. And there should be built-in cable management to hide the wires and make it look nice. For non-essential requirements, it'd be great if it had a built-in outlet or wireless charger. I was having trouble visualizing what I wanted to make, so I learned CAD and designed this desk with drawers. But I came to realize that what I wanted to make was way more than I could accomplish with my current skills. I had taken one woodworking class and that was my first woodworking project, so I tried to design a prototype that I could practice on. However, I realized that even though I had an idea at a smaller scale, that didn't address the skill gap that still existed, so I needed to take another look at my desk requirements. Drawers were out because I didn't know how to do pocket screws, dados, or anything like that. But I could make storage as a different project one day. Built-in cable management was also out for similar reasons. That left easy assembly and disassembly, so I looked for examples and inspiration. I looked around at the furniture in my house. I kept on seeing this pattern, but I barely knew how to operate a table saw or miter saw, so angle cuts weren't something I wanted to deal with. I also didn't want to have to create a jig for the crevice and holes, but I'm tucking away this pattern for the future. IKEA is known for easy assembly and disassembly, so I looked at diagrams for examples. I saw this bracket, but I wasn't able to find something like this at the hardware store. And this half circle part was the same story. I looked at some other methods, but this consideration for assembly and disassembly was becoming a sticking point and an obstacle to starting to make a desk, so I'll just figure it out later. So then I looked into tabletops. Live edge is expensive, so I crossed out that option. I actually bought a pre-made unfinished butcher's block, but I realized I would only be sanding and finishing and drilling some holes for the table legs, and that just didn't satisfy the beginner maker in me, so I returned the butcher block within the hour. At this point, I had taken a cutting board class, and I figured a butcher's block is like a bigger cutting board. I would be building off of my fundamentals, practicing the newest skills I had learned through the class, and the number of new skills I would need to learn would be more limited and manageable for me. I wanted to make a desk out of scrap pieces of wood, but I'm new to woodworking, so I didn't have any scrap. I figured someone had some to sell at a discounted price, but I didn't know where to look. I ended up going to a lumber supplier and getting random types of wood, and it ended up being expensive anyway. Next time, I would use this chart as a guide for choosing the type of wood for the project. I used a miter saw to cut the pieces smaller. I then ran those pieces through the table saw. I'm still new to the table saw, so I used a feather board to help maintain horizontal pressure, and someone helped me set up a roller to support the long pieces in the back. I learned through the cutting board class that if I set the distance between the blade and fence once and ran all the pieces through, then later I could just rotate the cut pieces 90 degrees and all of them would have the same height. For my design, it was okay if the strips of different wood species had different widths. I chose which pieces I wanted and used a miter saw to cut the remaining pieces to fill the gaps. Then I numbered each piece to indicate which was the top and how to fit them together. I had to group the pieces into 3 sections so that they would be able to fit onto the jointer and planer. Someone recommended I do a dry fit before gluing so that I could see how well all the pieces would fit together, and they pointed out to me that some of the pieces still had the factory edge. They said you can't be sure that the factory edge is square or surface to what you want, so I went back to the miter saw to cut those edges. I flipped the pieces over to the side where I would put the glue. So I had this moment where I actually didn't know how to open a wood glue bottle. I figured it was like Elmer's glue where you had to twist it, but the twisting wasn't working for me. So I actually had to go up to someone and ask, and I was told I could just pull it open. It was an embarrassing moment, but if I want to do any woodworking, I need to be able to open glue. I was using a silicone brush, but I learned afterwards that I could have just used my fingers to spread the glue. I learned about this tip where I could put glue on a piece, clamp it with quick clamps, and repeat that process piece by piece instead of putting glue on all the pieces and scrambling to clamp them all together all at once. I had made cauls ahead of time by wrapping some scrap pieces of wood with packing tape, and I clamped the cauls to the section to prevent it from bowing. I glued and clamped up the 3 sections and marked the tops and bottoms of them. I sent them through the jointer and planer to get them smooth. I learned afterwards that I could have wiped off the squeeze out with a damp rag, and that would have saved me some time. I got some help connecting the 3 sections with dominoes. Originally, I wanted the tabletop to have a height of 1.5 inches, so 0.7 definitely missed the mark, and it was just too flimsy structurally, so I decided to make a frame to support it. So I headed to the lumber supplier and picked through this pile of hickory. It turns out one of the pieces was a bit more bowed than the others, but someone gave me the advice that I could just cut it into smaller pieces so the bow wouldn't matter anymore. I took all the pieces to the jointer and then to the planer. I ran into an issue. This is what it's supposed to sound like with the blades cutting away at the top of the wood to make it smooth. However, what was going on was the wood would pass through without any cutting happening, and then after a small quarter turn, it'd get stuck. I didn't know what was going on and had to ask around. Someone recommended to me to just push it, and that worked. I still don't know what was making it get stuck in the first place, but at least I know I can try giving it a gentle push the next time. At first I was thinking I could get each piece individually surfaced, then find the piece that was the thinnest and get all the other pieces to match that height. But then I got the advice that I could just run all the pieces at each height of the planer and then stop when all the pieces were looking smooth. This would save time and ensure consistency. I put the pieces on top of the tabletop to see how it would look. I noticed that some pieces weren't perfectly square, so I went back to the miter saw. I made it better, but still not perfectly square. I wasn't sure if a little wiggle room was okay or not, so I figured a dry fit would tell me the answer. I measured and made markings for where the beams and domino holes would go. I started practicing the domino joiner on a test piece. Practicing was going well until suddenly the tool wasn't making holes. I think maybe the bit got loose.
What's it doing?
What a sound. I don't like that sound. Turns out the bit had broken. I thought maybe I had angled the tool while the bit was in the hole, but I'm not seeing that. Maybe the bit was just old or I was just being too rough on it. The bit was $60, but I replaced it and got reimbursed for it. After the embarrassment of breaking a $60 bit, I came back to practice again. I had gotten the advice to go more slowly and to make sure that I back out the bit completely before moving the machine to another spot. Then it was time for the real thing. I realized clamping one piece at a time would be time-consuming, so I clamped multiple pieces together. I did a dry fit and it looked good. It was time for the glue up. I spent a lot of time putting the glue on first before clamping, and then realizing that a lot of the glue had disappeared. Afterwards, I learned that the end grain absorbs the glue more quickly than edge grain. Ideally, I should have done this on the ground where everything was rotated 90 degrees and the holes would face up and down. I used a damp rag to wipe off the squeeze out. I prepped the tabletop in preparation for attaching it to the frame by removing dried glue and sanding it smooth. Someone helped me out to get this clamped up. I initially had it clamped to the table on two edges with the weights on the other two edges, but I realized the weights wouldn't have enough pressure, so we had to lift it up on some clamps and then reclamp it. The tabletop had sharp edges that I wanted to round out. I think it will look better aesthetically and also reduce the chance of splintering. This was only the second time I had used a palm router, so I needed to practice and also see if the shape of the curve was what I wanted. I set up the palm router with a round over bit. It turned out the curve was too small for my taste and I was going too slowly, so I left burn marks. I switched out the bit and tried again, and it looked worse! I learned I needed to adjust the height of the bit and also increase the speed of the router. The curve was the right size though. After many more practice runs, I was ready to take it to the table. It seemed to be going well until... Turned out the router base was catching on the second piece of wood, so I needed to sand down the frame so all the pieces were even. I was ready to try again. It looked good, so I went on to do all the outside edges. Before putting on finish, I had to do some cleanup and sanding. I didn't remove the squeeze out while it was wet, so I used a chisel and hammer to chip away at the dried glue. Sometimes, I didn't watch where my chisel was going. I tunnel visioned so much on getting the glue off that I didn't watch the corners of the chisel that would sometimes gouge the wood, or I didn't check the angle of the chisel and I'd take off a chunk of wood instead of just the glue. I learned I needed to have the chisel flush with the surface it was on and visualize the path the chisel would take so it wouldn't end up where it wasn't supposed to. This excess glue was only on the underside of the table where likely no one would see it, but I wanted to practice good habits. Until eventually I got tired and settled for good enough. Woo! Hammers are heavy! Then I used a detail sander with 80 grit sandpaper to get the rest of the glue spots off, while also sanding the inside edges of the frame. To help sand the bigger surface areas, I used a pencil to draw light wavy lines. If I could sand and remove all the pencil marks, it would be as close as I could get to sanding evenly. The sanders were too big to fit into the two pockets on either end, but someone at the makerspace had made me this makeshift sanding block using a piece of plywood and sandpaper, so I used that. I used the detail sander on the larger inside surfaces and the random orbital sander on the frame. I was ready to sand the outside edges of the tabletop, but I noticed that some parts, there were gaps between the top and bottom sections. This happened because I hadn't clamped the sections well enough initially and had to redo the clamping a second time when the glue had already begun drying. To attempt to fix the gaps, I tried spreading glue and sanding the edges so that the sawdust and glue would combine together and fill the gaps. I flipped the tabletop over and saw some nuts. I made the mistake of using glue and sawdust to fill them in instead of using clear super glue. The sawdust wasn't even the same color as the wood, so they're even uglier. After filling in the knots, I sanded the top side and the edges at 80, 120, and 220 grits. Unfortunately, throughout the whole sanding process, I had focused the sander on removing glue, taking out uneven seams, or smoothing over marks left by the track saw, and this created divots in the surfaces and messed up my routed edges. I needed to take the time to sand the whole surface evenly instead of using the sander over small spots that had issues. After many hours of sanding, it's ready for finishing. At least that's what I thought. I had taken the tabletop out to my garage to finish, but I had left it there over a few days when it had been storming. This change in moisture in the air warped the table. In my embarrassment, I forgot to take pictures or videos of it. I brought the tabletop back inside so it would reacclimate to its future home and waited several weeks for the tabletop to flatten again. Once it had flattened out, I continued working on it. When I had put glue on the edges and sanded the same day, I hadn't waited for the glue to cure, so I had to sand the edges again. While I was sanding, I discovered a hole! This was one of the domino holes. The hole was already close to the edge when I first made it, so when I used the track saw and sanded, it removed enough material to expose the hole. To fix it, I put on a few layers of wood filler. I was now actually ready for finishing. These were the items I used. For PPE, I had nitrile gloves and a respirator. For sanding and cleaning up the dust, I used 400, 800, and 1500 grit sandpaper, sackcloths, paper towels, and mineral spirits. For the finish itself, I had armor steel satin, popsicle sticks, plastic cups, rags, and a paint key. I made the rags by cutting up an old t-shirt and removed the lint using a lint roller. I was thinking I would try out the finish on the underside of the tabletop first, and that would help protect it as well. My camera fell over and I hadn't noticed until I was done. So this is how it looked after applying the finish once. I thought the bottom of the tabletop looked fine, so I moved on to the top. I prepared it by sanding it with 220 grit and used a tack cloth to remove the dust. I stirred up the finish in the can first before pouring it into a plastic cup. I then dipped the rag into the plastic cup and applied it to the tabletop in horizontal strokes starting at the edge and slightly overlapping my previous laying, stirring the finish in the plastic cup frequently. This is how it looked after the first coat. To prepare for the second coat, I sanded the top with 400 grit and used a tack cloth to take the dust off. I then wiped the tabletop with mineral spirits using a paper towel and used a rag to put on the finish. This is how it looked after the second coat. I realized I hadn't been sanding with feeling. What I mean is that I would swipe the sandpaper back and forth an equal number of times across the tabletop in an effort to evenly sand, but I hadn't been using my hands to feel if there were any bumps. This time though, I would sand with feeling and remove the bumps. To prepare for the fourth coat, I sanded at 800 grit. I also skipped the tack cloth because I realized that both the tack cloth and mineral spirits were used to remove the dust from sanding, but I didn't need to do both. I was supposed to be done after the fourth coat, but it didn't look evenly shiny, so I did another. This time, I tried a foam brush to see if that would help make the finish more even. This looked better, but there were still some spots that were lacking shininess, so I tried again. I didn't think the foam brush helped make the finish more even, so this time I went back to the rag and wiped with a back and forth motion. I decided that this was my last coat, so I sanded it with 1500 grit sandpaper. It's still slightly unevenly shiny, but it's better than before, and I think it's as good as it's going to get. The main goal was to protect the wood, so with 6 coats, I think I've accomplished that. Next time, I would skip the tack cloth completely, put more finish on for the first coat, use a rag and wipe back and forth, and look for shininess throughout the process. This should save time and resources, and also help with evenly finishing. I waited about a month for the finish to cure per the directions on the can. Then it was time to attach legs to the tabletop. I decided to use the standing desk frame from my old desk. I wanted a way for the tabletop and frame to attach and detach easily, so I decided to use insert nuts. The insert nuts I used had a hole for a hex key on one end to help get it into the wood, nuts on the outside that could bite into the wood, and the inside was threaded so a screw could fit into it. This was my first time using these insert nuts, so I didn't know what kind of screw would fit into the threads, but I learned that on the packaging for the insert nuts and screws that the first 2 measurements should match, so that would be the width of the screw and the threads per inch. The last measurement is the length. On the back of the packaging, it had the directions for what size hole needed to be drilled and the size of the hex key to screw it in. My drill came with a set of wood drilling bits, but I didn't have one that was 11/32 though. I thought about buying one, but it would have been $11 for one bit or $50 for a whole set. I had a bit that was 5/16 though, so I decided I would try it out, and if the hole wasn't big enough, I'd just wiggle it a bit. I tried using the bit on a test piece, and despite applying a lot of pressure, it got stuck and the hole wouldn't deepen. I thought maybe it could have been the piece of wood I was using, so I tried what looked like scrap from making the desk, and that didn't work either. Luckily, I had another set of drill bits, but this time in metric, so I tried an 8mm, and that worked! Now, I would make a joke about how metric is better than imperial, but I wanted to know why I had such a different experience with these drill bits. The clearest difference was the brands. The shape of the bits looked similar, so maybe it came down to the material they were made of, which I couldn't find more information about. I wanted to see if the insert nut would fit, and it didn't. So it was time to wiggle. I leaned the drill bit to the sides to make the hole bigger, and the insert nut fit. I wanted to see how close I was to 11/32, so I set my digital calipers and compared the holes. I could do with a little less of a lean, and the hole could be more of a circle instead of an oval. It was time to put holes, intentionally this time, into the tabletop. I set my compound square to the right measurements and made marks. I learned about this trick where I could use painter's tape to mark my drill bit to help me gauge how deep I needed to go. I tried putting in the insert nut, but it didn't go deep enough. I realized that the tip of the brad point bit didn't make a hole wide enough for the insert nut. I needed to measure from where the flutes were instead of the tip. Additionally, my connecting bolt was much longer than my insert nut, so if I drilled a hole deep enough to accommodate that, I would actually end up drilling completely through the tabletop. So I ended up getting shorter screws. I put in the rest of the holes and insert nuts and attached the tabletop with washers and the new screws. And this is my new desk!